Just take it. It's only worth about $20, maybe 30. It's just an old military thing Grandpa never talked about." Those were the words spoken by a woman in her late 30s, standing beside a folding table in the driveway of a split-level house on Rue des Érables in Sainte-Foy, Quebec, on a grey Saturday morning in late September. She had her mother's eyes and her father's impatience, and she was holding a paper cup of Tim Hortons coffee that had gone cold half an hour ago. She wasn't being cruel. She genuinely didn't know. That was the part that would stay with the old man across the table for a long time afterward. The old man was 74 years old. His name was Corporal Eugene Pellerin, retired, though he would have told you the rank never really retires, it just gets quieter. He wore a grey wool sweater under a canvas barn coat, work pants with a crease in them that his late wife Celeste had ironed every Sunday morning for 31 years out of habit, and boots that had been resoled twice. His hair was white and cut close, the way a man cuts his hair when he's stopped caring what it looks like and started caring only that it stays out of his way. He had driven his 2003 Chevrolet Silverado 40 minutes from his apartment in Lévis that morning because estate sales pulled him the way they pull certain kinds of people, not to buy, not really, but to bear witness. Every table set out on every lawn was a life that had been lived and finished, and Eugene Pellerin, who had served 2 years in Korea with the Royal 22e Regiment and come home without making a sound about any of it, understood something about the kind of lives that ended without enough people paying attention. He had spotted the handwritten signs on the boulevard. Succession Vaillancourt. Samedi, 8h à Cotin, tout doit partir. Everything must go. He had turned in without thinking too hard about it. The house was a modest place with a vegetable garden gone to seed for the autumn and a blue spruce in the front yard that someone had planted when it was knee-high and never expected to outlive. There were card tables on the driveway, a few more in the open garage, boxes labelled in black marker, dishes, books, outils de jardin. There was a younger man, maybe 40, moving things around without any clear purpose, the way people move things around at estate sales when they don't want to be there. A teenage boy sat on the front step looking at his phone. The woman with the cold coffee was managing the transactions, which mostly meant telling people prices she'd made up that morning, and trying not to think too hard about what any of it meant. Eugene walked slow. His right hip had been giving him trouble since July, and his doctor at the CLSC had referred him to a specialist he hadn't yet bothered to see. He moved past the garden tools and the stacked Tupperware and the cardboard box of mystery novels with their spines cracked from rereading. He was making his way toward the garage when he saw it. A wooden box, roughly the size of a large briefcase, sitting on a card table between a box of Christmas ornaments and a bread machine still in its original packaging. The wood was dark with age, the corners reinforced with small brass fittings that had gone the colour of old pennies. There was a piece of white masking tape on the lid with 25 written on it in blue marker. Underneath the price, in smaller letters, "Military stuff, works fine." Eugene Pellerin stopped walking. He did not reach for the box. He stood looking at it the way a man looks at something that has no business being where it is. He looked at the wood, the grain of it, the way the lid sat in its frame. He looked at the small brass latch on the front. He looked at a mark on the lower right corner, a long pale gouge in the wood, the kind of mark a peg stake makes when a wooden case gets dropped wrong in the dark on a hillside. He breathed in through his nose. Then he turned and walked back to the woman with the cold coffee. "Excuse me," he said, in the careful, courteous English he'd learned to use in the years since Celeste had passed, and he'd started spending time at the Legion Hall in Lévis, where the Anglophone veterans sometimes gathered on Tuesday evenings. "That wooden box, near the Christmas things, is it for sale?" The woman looked toward the garage. "That one? Oh, sure, everything's for sale. That's just an old military thing. My grandfather never talked about it. Take it for 20, maybe 30. It's just worth about that, I think." Her husband, the man who'd been moving things without purpose, drifted over. "We found it in the back of his closet," he said, "behind his winter coats. Honestly, we almost threw it out. Figured someone might collect that kind of thing." He shrugged the way a man shrugs when he's assigned no meaning to an object and doesn't intend to start. "Would you mind if I had a look inside?" Eugene asked. "Go ahead," the woman said. "Be my guest." Eugene walked back to the garage. He set his hand on the lid of the box for a moment before he opened it. Then he pressed the brass latch and lifted. Inside, resting in a bed of dark green wool felt, the kind of military issue wool that has its own particular texture, Nothing like civilian fabric, was a Lee-Enfield No. 4 MKI rifle. The bluing on the barrel had worn to a pale grey at the muzzle and at the back of the bolt. The stock was walnut, darkened by decades of oil and handling, with a shallow crack running from the pistol grip toward the butt that someone had filled long ago with something dark. The scope, a No. 32 Mk3, was still mounted in its brackets above the receiver. It had a small chip in the left side of the ocular lens housing, a chip like a half moon. Eugene looked at the stock. He looked at the receiver. He looked at the serial number stamped into the metal above the trigger guard, a number that began with a letter C and ended in 3 digits he had not said out loud since the winter of 1952. Then he looked at the underside of the stock, near where the heel of a right hand would rest during a shot. There was a set of initials scratched there in uneven capitals, the kind scratched with a knife blade rather than engraved, JPL, and beneath them, almost too faint to read, a date, Feb 14, 1951. Valentine's Day, 1951. Eugene Pellerin's hands did not shake. He had decided a long time ago that his hands would not shake, and they had mostly respected that decision. But something happened behind his eyes that he would not have been able to name accurately if someone had asked him to. He closed the box carefully, the way you close something that has earned the right to be closed carefully. He latched it. He stood up straight. Then he walked back to the woman with the cold coffee and stood in front of her until she looked up from her phone. "Ma'am," he said, "what was your grandfather's name?" She frowned slightly. "Grandpa? His name was Aurel Lanthier." "Why, and he served in the military, your grandfather?" "I think so, briefly. He never really talked about it. Mom always said he was in the army for a couple of years when he was young and then came back and worked for the city, road maintenance. He was just very quiet about that part of his life. We never pushed him on it." She paused. "Did you know him?" Eugene was quiet for long enough that her husband looked up. "Yes," Eugene said finally. "We were together on Hill 355 in February of 1951. Your grandfather saved my life on the 14th of that month. The rifle in that box is the one he used to do it. If you believe that the things a quiet man leaves behind deserve more than a price sticker made of masking tape, type the word service in the comments right now." The woman's name was Nathalie Lanthier Bouvier. Her husband was called David. The teenager on the front step was their son, Matthew, who had put his phone down and was now watching from the driveway with an expression he would not have been able to describe. Nathalie pulled over a folding chair. Eugene Pellerin did not pick it up. He set it aside gently and asked if there was somewhere inside where they could sit, because what he had to say was going to take some time, and he was 74 years old, and his hip was bothering him, and he would prefer to say it properly. They went inside. Nathalie made tea. It was the kind of thing a person does when they don't know what else to do with their hands, and Eugene understood this, and he sat at the kitchen table with the wooden box in front of him and waited until she was ready. Then he told them that Aurel Lanthier had been a private in the 2nd Battalion of the Royal 22e Regiment, better known to Canadians as the Vendus, and that in the winter of 1950 to 1951, the Vendus had been part of the 25th Canadian Infantry Brigade deployed to Korea as part of the United Nations Command. He told them that Aurel Lanthier had been a designated marksman, not officially listed as a sniper in the battalion records, because the army at that time preferred to distribute that particular skill quietly rather than advertise it, and that Eugene himself had been his section corporal, which meant that for 7 months they had moved, slept, eaten, and worked within 50 meters of each other in country that was cold in a way that went through wool and canvas and seemed to settle permanently into a man's bones. He told them that February 14th, 1951 had been a Tuesday. He remembered this because the Tuesday before it, someone had gotten a case of Valentine's Day chocolates in a mail parcel from back home and shared them around the section. And Eugene had thought about Celeste, who he had not yet married, and about the letter he had not yet written her, and about how cold his feet were. He told them that on that Tuesday morning, their position on the forward slope of Hill 355. A rise the soldiers called Little Gibraltar for reasons that would only make sense to someone who had stood on it in the grey Korean dawn and looked at what surrounded them, had been probed by a Chinese reconnaissance patrol at first light. The probe had become something else. It had become fast and loud and close. Their section lieutenant, a young officer from Trois-Rivières named Boivin, who had been in country for 11 days, and who would be returned home 6 months later missing 2 fingers on his left hand, had been hit in the first minutes and gone down in the open ground between 2 fighting positions. Eugene had gone after him. He told this part of the story the way veterans tell the parts of stories they have thought about every day, for decades, flatly, without drama, as if they were describing a thing they had watched happen to someone else. He said, "I went out to get Boyven. I shouldn't have. It wasn't the right decision tactically, I just went." He said it the way a man says a thing he has stopped arguing with himself about. He had gotten to Boyven and gotten a tourniquet on him, and was lying in a depression in the frozen ground with nowhere useful to go when the firing from the ridge to the northeast, a fixed position that had been pinning them from an angle that made it almost impossible to address, simply stopped. It stopped for 5 seconds, then it stopped for 30, then it stopped for the rest of the engagement. When they got Boyven back to the aid station and Eugene came back to the section position, Aurel Lanthier was sitting with his back against the sandbag wall, cleaning his rifle in the particular unhurried way he always cleaned his rifle, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world and there was nothing else that needed doing. Eugene had asked him, "Was that you? The position on the ridge?" Aurel had looked up. He had a face that was difficult to read under ordinary circumstances, and the circumstances were not ordinary. He said, 640 meters, wind from the northwest at about 12 kilometers. The chip on the scope lens makes it pull left, so I compensate. Then he went back to cleaning his rifle. He did not say anything else about it. Not that day, not in the months that followed, not when Boyven wrote to him from a hospital in Japan and thanked him. Not ever, as far as Eugene knew. Eugene told them that Aurel Lanthier had been recommended for a military medal for the action that morning. He told them that the recommendation had gone through channels and come back downgraded to a mention in dispatches, because the army of 1951 had its own particular economy of recognition, and it did not always spend that currency in ways a reasonable person would understand. He told them that Aurel had not seemed bothered by this. He had seemed, if anything, relieved. "He told me once," Eugene said, holding his tea with both hands, "that he didn't want a medal for doing what anyone would have done. I told him that wasn't true. Not everyone would have taken that shot at that distance with that wind and that light and that scope." He said, "You would have," I said. "I don't have your eye." He said, "No, but you went out to get Boyven." Eugene paused. We understood each other after that. Some men are made that way. They don't need to explain themselves, and they don't need to be explained. Nathalie had her hand over her mouth. David had stopped pretending to look anywhere but at the wooden box on the table. Mathieu had come inside at some point and was sitting in the doorway to the kitchen, his phone face down on his knee. "The initials on the stock," Nathalie said finally. "JPL Jean-Paul Lanthier," Eugene said. "His father's rifle originally. He told me once that his father had carried it on the family farm outside Rimouski before the war. He brought it over with him when he shipped out. The army didn't officially approve, but nobody said anything because nobody argued with what Aurel Lanthier could do with it." "We didn't know," David said. "He had the look of a man recalibrating something he thought he understood. He never said anything. Not at Christmas, not at Remembrance Day, nothing. He'd wear the poppy and he'd go quiet, and we always thought it was just, how older people got. Sad, remembering people who were gone." "He was remembering people who were gone," Eugene said. "He was just being careful about what he chose to carry in front of you. That was the kind of man he was." "Mathieu had a project in school once," Nathalie said, and her voice was the voice of someone who has just understood something they wish they'd understood sooner. Grade 8. He was supposed to interview a family member who had served. We asked Grandpa Aurel, and he said he wasn't sure he had much to say. He sat with Mathieu for about 20 minutes, and he talked about the food. He talked about how they made coffee in Korea in the winter. He never mentioned. She stopped. Mathieu in the doorway said quietly, "He told me the coffee was terrible. He said he didn't think he'd ever been as cold as he was in Korea, but at least the coffee was hot, even if it was terrible." Eugene almost smiled. "That sounds right," he said. "The coffee was terrible. He used to say that if they made the enemy drink enough of it, the war would end faster." Mathieu looked at the wooden box. "He talked to me about the coffee for 20 minutes, and I had no idea." "He knew you were too young," Eugene said, not unkindly. "He would have told you the rest eventually. He just ran out of time." This was the truest thing Eugene said in that kitchen, and the room held it for a moment before anyone breathed. Nathalie asked how Eugene had lost touch with him. Eugene told her, the way men lose touch in the years after wars, which is gradually, and then suddenly, through the accumulation of small distances. He had moved from Quebec City to Lévis in 1967 when the bridge made the commute practical, and Aurel had moved to the Saguenay for work and then back to Sainte-Foy in his 60s. They had exchanged letters through the late 50s and into the 60s. The letters had gotten shorter. Then there had been a gap of a few years that became a gap of a decade, the way those things do. He had tried to find Aurel through the Royal Canadian Legion in 1988, and again in 2001, after September of that year had made him think about the people in his life who were still alive and whom he hadn't spoken to in too long. He had never managed it. Aurel Lanthier, it turned out, was the kind of man who did not particularly want to be found by the world and was reasonably good at not being found. He would have wanted to hear from you, Nathalie said. I'm sure of it, I know, Eugene said. I'm sure of it too. That's the part that doesn't sit easy. He told them the rest of what he knew, that Aurel had been a man who could calculate wind drift in his head while lying in frozen mud and make it look like nothing remarkable, and who had once, during a lull in a long night on the MLR, repaired a section mate's broken watch using nothing but a pen cap and his own thumbnail, that he had been quietly, steadily and without announcement the most reliable person in any room he was in, that Henry Boyven, the lieutenant from Trois-Rivières, whose fingers he had saved along with the rest of him, had sent Eugene a Christmas card every year until 1994 when the cards had stopped, and that every card had contained a line about Aurel Lanthier. Give my regards to your friend with the rifle, if you're still in touch. He hadn't been, and the cards had stopped, and Eugene had thought about that more than was useful. He told them that he had not come to buy the rifle. He told them this clearly because he wanted it to be clear. He had not come to this house on Rue des Érables to purchase anything. He had come because estate sales pulled him the way they always had, and because the wooden box had been on a card table between the Christmas ornaments and the bread machine with a piece of masking tape on it, and because some things should not be reduced to that. The rifle belongs here, he said, with your family. It belonged to Aurel Lanthier's father before it belonged to Aurel, and now it belongs to you, and I hope one day it will belong to Mathieu. And I hope Mathieu will tell his children what it was used for, and by whom and on what morning and why. He put his hand flat on the lid of the wooden box. That's the only thing I came here for, to make sure somebody in this family knew. There was a long silence in the kitchen on Rue des Érables. Then Nathalie said, very quietly, would you stay for lunch? And Eugene Pellerin, who had not been asked to stay for lunch anywhere in a long time, said yes. They ate soup and bread at the kitchen table. The estate sale outside went on without anyone managing it particularly well, and nobody seemed to mind. Nathalie called her mother in Rimouski, who was Aurel's daughter, and who cried on the phone in the way that people cry when they receive something they didn't know they had been missing. Mathieu asked questions, carefully at first, and then less carefully, the way young people ask questions when they have decided someone is worth the asking, and Eugene answered them all. He talked about the cold. He talked about the food. He talked about what it looked like on the slope of Hill 355 at first light in February, when the snow was hard and the light was white and flat and came from everywhere at once. He did not talk about the men who had not come home. That was for another conversation, and there would be time for it. He had decided there would be time for it. A retired warrant officer from the Valcartier garrison, a man named Théodore Gravel, who had been a friend of Aurel's in his later years, and who Nathalie had called on impulse, arrived at 3 in the afternoon and stood in the kitchen doorway, looking at the wooden box on the table for a long moment before he came inside, and shook Eugene's hand without saying anything, which is its own particular kind of language. By 4 o'clock, the estate sale had been quietly closed. The card tables in the driveway had been folded up. The wooden box sat alone on the kitchen table in a space that had been made for it, the way you make space for something once you understand its weight. Eugene drove back to Lévis that evening on the autoroute with his window down 2 inches, the October air carrying the smell of the river and the particular cold that arrives in Quebec before the leaves are entirely gone. He had not taken the rifle. He had not taken anything. Nathalie had pressed a photograph into his hands at the door, a small black and white print, clearly a copy of a copy, showing a group of young men in uniform outside what appeared to be a temporary structure of some kind, the kind of structure that gets put up fast and taken down fast in a war. She had found it that morning in the same closet as the wooden box, in a shoebox underneath Aurel's service dress cap, in a small envelope that had been sealed and never opened. Eugene did not open it until he was home. He sat at his kitchen table in Levis, under the hanging lamp that Celeste had chosen in 1974, and that he had never replaced because the light it made was the right light, and he looked at the photograph for a long time. There were 6 young men in the picture. They were all thin in the way that young men get thin in the field, and they were all grinning in the way that young men grin when they are cold and tired and glad to be alive, and not yet old enough to know they should be more careful about grinning. Eugene was on the left, barely recognizable to himself, 22 years old, and holding a cup of something hot with both hands. Aurel was beside him, second from left, one hand on Eugene's shoulder, in the easy way of men who have gotten past the need to be careful with each other. On the back of the photograph, in Aurel's handwriting, which Eugene recognized immediately, though he had not seen it in 50 years. Hill 355, February 1951. The worst coffee in human history. Worth it. Eugene sat with the photograph until the lamp's light seemed warmer than it had. Then he got out a piece of paper and began to write. He wrote to Nathalie Lanthier-Bouvier. He wrote 4 pages in the block printing of a man who learned to write in a field notebook, in conditions that made cursive impractical, and he told her the things he had not said at the kitchen table, the daily things, the quiet things, the things that make a man rather than a story. He told her that her grandfather had kept a small paperback French dictionary in his breast pocket, and had read one new word from it every morning before breakfast, because he said the army had a way of making a man's vocabulary very small, and he intended to come back from it with a bigger one than he'd left with. He told her that Aurel Lanthier had given his last cigarette to a wounded Chinese prisoner on a stretcher at a forward aid station in March of 1951, had lit it for him, and had not mentioned it to anyone. He told her that her grandfather had talked about Quebec in the winter the way men talk about the places they are trying to hold on to inside themselves. The ice on the Saguenay, the sound the snow makes under good boots, the particular grey of a February sky over the river that he said looked like nothing else in the world. He sealed the letter and walked to the mailbox at the end of the hallway. His building had a bank of them near the entrance, the old-fashioned kind with brass plates and small locks, and he put it in the outgoing slot. Then he went to his window and stood looking out at the lights of Lévis, and across the river at the lights of Quebec City. On the cliff they spread out, cold and yellow in the October dark, and he thought about a man he had known for 7 months in 1951, who had read one new word from a dictionary every morning, and had given his last cigarette to an enemy soldier on a stretcher, and had carried his father's rifle across the world and brought it home and never said a word about any of it. Quiet men are not simple men. They are men who have decided that some things belong to them alone, not because they are ashamed of those things, but because those things are too large and too precise for ordinary conversation, and because the weight of them is something they have chosen to carry without distributing it to the people they love. This is a form of generosity that goes almost entirely unrecognized, and it is one of the oldest forms there is. The lesson, if there is one, is the same lesson it has always been. It costs nothing to ask. It costs an enormous amount not to. The old men at the Legion halls and the diner counters and the Saturday morning estate sales are carrying things that will disappear when they do, unless someone sits down across from them and asks. Not about the war, not about the headlines, just about the coffee, just about the cold, just about what the sky looked like over the river in February, back when they were young and thin and grinning in the wrong kind of way. If this story stayed with you, if you believe that the quiet men in your own family deserve to be asked before it's too late, share this video with someone who still has time to ask. Subscribe to Echoes of Courage, because these stories will not tell themselves. And the next time you see an old veteran with a poppy on his lapel and nothing to say for himself, sit down. Ask him about the coffee. Because you never know what he's carrying home from a hill you've never heard of. And you never know what's sitting in a wooden box in the back of his closet, waiting for someone to understand what it means.